Good morning, church. I want to say welcome. Glad that you came out this snowy morning to worship together. I just want to encourage you, inside your worship folder, you'll find some notes to connect in with to help follow along with today's message. On the back of your worship folder is also a QR code if you want to check in with the YouVersion Bible app. It'll connect you in with that. So open your Bibles with me to John chapter 1 this morning as we celebrate this very first Sunday of Advent. We have our Advent calendar and lighting the candles as a way of causing us to slow down maybe a little bit. How about everybody, Thanksgiving meal, your stomachs may still be full. Can we just all take a deep breath? Yeah. It's crazy the pace that we keep. It's crazy the get everything ready for Thanksgiving, have all the family gather together, and then make sure you're out the door at 5 a.m. Friday morning because it's Black Friday. But more and more people aren't going to Black Friday. How many of you spent your Black Friday online this year? Yeah, more and more of you are doing all of that online, but it's this rush. There's these lists. We have to accomplish more and more and more. Yesterday I came in and was thankful as I sat in my office and looked out the window and saw the gently fallen snow coming down. And I don't know if you enjoyed that yesterday. I hope you did. We'll enjoy it to maybe mid-January, and then we'll wish it to go away. But for now, there's always something special. The white covering up the brown causes us just to slow down and reflect. And that's what we want to do this Advent season. Advent is celebrating the arrival of Jesus. How can we wait? How can we pause? How can we prepare ourselves to experience him in a fresh way? That's why we're in a series we're calling When God Steps In, this season of preparation. What was it like for God to step in that moment of history? What is it like for God to step in your life today? And you would expect it, right? Advent, let's make sure we make Jesus the reason for the season. But I want to go deeper than that. I want us to walk through John chapter 1, perhaps one of the greatest theological verses, treatise, if you were to call it. Some have said it's been almost put into a hymn-like format. John is very poetic here in his writing to help us slow down and go deeper than just, seeing Jesus as the reason for the season, but to see what God might do if he were to step into your life this holiday season. Because where do you need him? Where do you need that fresh touch? So why? Some of you might be dealing with some physical health. You need God to step into that. Others of you got relationship issues, maybe with your teenage kids, adult kids, and you got to step into that. Some of you maybe are just dealing with this same struggle of sin with your anger or past habits. Your life just isn't peaceful, and you're seeking other things to somehow find some type of pleasure because of the stress, and you got to step into that. Young parents these days trying to juggle your jobs and kids and expectations on the holidays. Time to shop, time to connect with extended family. Then you come to church and they're telling you need to spend time with God, and you wonder, how in the world am I going to get any of that done? I think we need God to step into that as well. Very often what happens in our circumstances in life, our thoughts get trapped. Our thoughts get trapped and we replay them over and over again, or we replay our situation or the one who hurt us or the job or the finances or the health, and we replay it over and over again. And pretty soon that circumstance, as I'm not belittling it, but pretty soon that circumstance grows and grows and grows and grows and grows and becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And in the meantime, because of our busyness of life, we squeeze God out and God becomes smaller, 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 and smaller. And in our day and age, in our culture, trying to think about who Jesus is, it's almost like we try to communicate, like in the old Joan Osborne song, "One of God was one of us," and God becomes this small one of us. And I think we need to see him for who he really is. We need to step in, have him step into our lives as who he really is. And so that's where we're going this Advent season. So think about that very first Christmas. Think about the conditions and the circumstances that seemed very big to them, and they were. People were overrun with poverty, sickness, major emotional distress, major spiritual oppression. Somehow they were trying to be near to God by keeping all of these rules, and heaven seemed to be quiet because back then in those ancient days the prophets hadn't spoken in a long time. So if their circumstances were big, they were. And then God chose to step into them. As we look at 1 John, I hope we could see that. Follow along as I read, not 1 John, John chapter 1. Follow along as I read John chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. Here in John chapter 1, those are the only two verses we're going to look at today. Over the last 2,000 years, there's been a critical debate. Who is this Jesus? Who was this Jesus? And in this critical debate that continues to go on today, there's all kinds of explanations. Jesus was a great teacher, but he was just a man. Others say he was a prophet. Others say he was a revolutionary. Columnists from Time magazine or PBS, other news organizations, even Oprah got into it. They've weighed their opinion on who Jesus is or who Jesus was. You can go to Mall of America. You can take a survey. Just say, hey, I'm going to take this blank survey. I'm going to walk to Mall of America, and I'm just going to ask people, who do you think Jesus is? And you're going to get a ton of different opinions. Here we have John, very close friend of Jesus. And I want you to understand as we dive into this, he is not mixing words. I mean, you can do your own study, but historians going all the way back to the 2nd century make a very clear argument that this guy, John, who was a friend of Jesus, really existed. If you doubt historians, I looked it up on ChatGPT yesterday. They compiled the information. It was clear. The consensus is really simple. Multiple early sources referred to John. He really exists. All four canonical canons of the Gospels, the book of Acts, writers of early Christian leaders, Papyrus, Irenaeus, Polycarp. The sources were ancient, they were independent, they were consistent. There was a disciple named John. No serious historian argues that. They agree in the historical figure was one of Jesus' disciples. He existed. So I think as we read this, it's really important that we understand. We take it for granted, but this is John who hung out with Jesus. And I don't know about you, then because of that, I think it's a good idea that we pay attention to what he has to say about him. In our day and age, I don't know you're in church on Sunday, and I know it's Advent, but we get bombarded with all kinds of thoughts. We need to get back to the orthodox teaching of who Jesus is. And by orthodox, I'm not referring to denomination. I'm not referring to Greek Orthodox, but rather orthodox as the standard of faith as to who Jesus is. So this month, we're going to be going through John's statements of who Jesus is. I have 3 overarching principles around this question, why Jesus today? And I want you to, they're theological statements, but I want you to hang in there with me as we go through them, because in the end, I'm going to say why it matters to you today. So here we go. Number 1, Jesus was, or you can have in parentheses, Jesus is before anything even began, anything started. He exists far beyond anything we think of related to time and space. In the beginning, the Word already existed. I love how the New Living translates that. John is using very clear words, profound words. In the beginning, the Word existed. And in case you missed it in the first verse, it's so important to him, he repeats it in the second verse. He just flips the phrases around. He existed in the beginning with God. Now, if you were a Jewish reader back then, this would have caused you to think of another verse, and maybe it brings to your mind this other verse, and it started in the very first part of your Bibles in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning. John starts his gospel with in the beginning. John is making an absolute statement here. Jesus existed before Genesis 1:1. Jesus existed before there was any time or space or matter. Jesus existed when there was nothing at all, and this nothing was made into something. And if our minds, because we're finite, have a hard time to grasp, but philosophers, scientists, everyone has to deal with this. We talked about this a few weeks ago, nothing becoming something. Even if you are a believer in the Big Bang Theory, there still is a nothing, and that nothing is a ball of matter. That nothing, that ball of matter, technically is a deity. It has to be, because it existed before something. Every philosopher, every scientist has to deal with that. I'm not going to debate all that this morning. We did that a few weeks ago. But John is saying clearly, Jesus was not created. He existed before creation. It's hard for us to get our minds around that, but look with me at Psalm 90. Lord, though through all the generations you've been our home before the mountains were born, you gave birth to the earth and to the world. From beginning to end, you are God. John here is saying Jesus is that God. Very clear. He reminds us through Jesus' words himself in John 8:58. I tell you the truth, before Abraham was even born, I am. This I am, this saying of is the name for God in the Old Testament, Yahweh. I have always existed. Jesus is being very clear here. So when John writes this treatise in the first two verses, he's recalling the words of Jesus. Now you need to understand this. Our pop culture actually uses this term. Our pop culture wrestles with this existence of God in the Marvel series, if you're familiar with that. How many of you are familiar with the Marvel series? Character Vision in that Marvel series. It's in their comic book movies. He was created, but he was made from an infinity stone. Infinite, infinity, stone meaning it wasn't created. So much so that in the movie, he describes himself as I am. When I heard that, I almost jumped out of my seat. So everyone's thinking about this. Something has to exist, and I don't know how stones could exist before anything else, but anyway, everything has to exist before something does. You can debate that with the other sci-fi friends of the next Comic-Con. I just want you to see this stuff. It's that important. It ends up in the movies. Everyone comes down to wrestling with this. Jesus taught this about himself in his prayer. Now, Father, bring me into the glory that we shared before when? Before the world began. So whether it's with coworkers or friends at school, maybe it's just an assumption in your life that this is who Jesus is. It's not an assumption out in the world today. For John, it was not just an assumption, oh yeah, everybody gets this. He begins his gospel with this. He declares it in the book of Revelation in the vision of heaven. He sees the praise and the worship. You are worthy, O Lord our God, to receive the glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and they exist before you created what you pleased. You created all things. Number two, why Jesus? Jesus is in a shared personal relationship with God. And then it says here, look at the second phrase of John chapter 1, and the Word was with God. So first point, remember, Jesus was not created, he is God, and now Jesus was creating, he was with God. How can that be? Jesus is God, clear declaration, and now it says Jesus was with God. Well, John is not bringing in some new theology. This is actually Old Testament theology. There always existed a Godhead, one God made of three distinct identity, one God in full essence. We call it today the doctrine of the Trinity, God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, we're not going down that road either today. We just need to understand what John is doing here. Say Jesus is God and he was with God. It comes from Genesis chapter 1. Then God said, let us make human beings into our own image to be like us. And then John later on records Jesus' explanation of himself. I want you to see this. He's with God, and you're going to understand a little bit. John 14, Philip said, Lord, show us the Father, and we will be satisfied. Jesus replied, have I been with you all this time, Philip, and yet you still don't know who I am? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. So why do you asking me to show him to you? Do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? I speak words that are not my own, but my Father who lives in me does his work through me. Jesus, before all time, before all creation, existed with the Father. Two persons. Doesn't mean they're brothers. They're not like Thor and Loki fighting to who's going to get power here. And the very essence is one God, they're the same. Jesus prays, Father, I want these whom you have given me to be with me where I am so they can see all glory that you've given me because you loved me even before the world began. There's a distinct relationship with God the Father and God the Son. Leads me to number 3. Jesus is God's full self. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Once again, I'm running through some theology because I want you to see how it will apply to your life today. John uses the word, big W, W-O-R-D, to describe Jesus. So let's just talk for a moment of why that's important. So in the Old Testament, how did God show himself? How did God reveal himself? Some might say through a burning bush. Some might say through a pillar of fire, a cloud. Some might say that the presence that filled the temple. But God revealed himself more than just in these supernatural images. It was more than just some Star Trek episode where this being shows up and everyone's left to kind of figure out who it is. When God wanted to reveal himself in detail, he used a language. He used words. Specific people heard from God using words, and they revealed in words who God said he was to be. Authors of the law and the prophets and the songs. But that seems rather obvious, right? It seems rather obvious that you have in your hands, perhaps today, a Bible, the Old Testament, that there are words. But we need words to be used so that we can know something about someone. Would you agree? We need words that can stir up emotions. We need words to describe pictures. Otherwise, they're just kind of images out there. So, for instance, if I show you this picture, a picture of, who's this? Okay, George Washington. We all know that. Now, if we didn't have any words that would describe this, if we hadn't heard any historical record of words, we might look at that and somebody say, who is that? Well, that's kind of like he's balding, I guess. He's got kind of formal clothes on, so you know, he's got kind of a serious look. So he must be somebody important. But even in that, what am I doing? I'm using words to describe him. But let's say there's even home videos of George Washington. Let's say that there was some YouTube videos that actually showed who George Washington was or had some actions of George Washington, but there's no words and you had to listen to them in silent with no closed captioning. Maybe we could jump to some conclusions about who he was and what we are seeing. But what John is saying here is our God has wanted to reveal himself, and in doing so, he has used words. Would you agree? If you love someone in your life and you haven't used words to tell them that, you better start today. Words matter. So important because this is what John is saying about Jesus. Yes, we use words, spoken words, language words, to describe who God is. It was done over and over and over and over again because God wanted to reveal himself, and he spoke words to people so we could understand words. Now, John is saying, here Jesus is the Word, meaning the explanation of all the words, the explanation of everything. You look at Jesus and you see the very full description of who God is. His teachings, by what he did, by his ministry and miracles, everything about him is the Word, the revelation of God. You can see it in 3 ways. Jesus is God's full self-expression, God's heart for people, God's creation. Jesus came to demonstrate the very full expression of who God is. We see love, we see kindness. I'm using words here. We see hatred of sin. We see forgiveness of sin. We see God's patience. We see all the different personality parts of God. We see that all. I'm using words here, but if we watch Jesus, if we listen to Jesus, it would describe who God is perfectly. If you ever wonder, I wonder what God thinks of me. I wonder how he's going to respond to me. You see, how did Jesus respond? How did Jesus teach? What did he communicate? How did he interact with the woman at the well? What parables did he teach about the prodigal son? In every circumstance of our lives, we can look to Jesus. If we say, God, how would you respond to this circumstance? We look to Jesus because he's the Word. Secondly, we see God's full self-will. In other words, God's will being miraculously placed upon his creation. He had a willful plan. God used a voice to create the world. And now through Jesus, he uses his very word, his Son, to demonstrate his purpose and plan, to save, to rescue, to redeem. We see all the works of God and the will of God be accomplished through Jesus. We see the will of the Father to heal, to restore, to set free. We see the will of the Father to bring his kingdom in, and that will, that self-expression of his very purpose and plan, the very fingerprint of God on his creation is through Jesus. Lastly, we see God's full self-disclosure. In other words, what the mystery of God that we might have seen as being hidden has now, as Paul says, been revealed to us. What appeared to be distant is celebrated at Christmas in the incarnation of Christ as God coming near. John would later write in this chapter, no one has ever seen God but the unique one, who is himself God, is near to the Father's heart. He has revealed God to us. The very distant God has now chosen to reveal himself in very real ways, in ways that we can understand, in teachings that we can understand, in a very human form that we can understand. So that's the theology of the two first verses in the book of John. So why is that important to you today? Why Jesus today in your holiday season? How many of you been to a catechism or a confirmation class of some kind? A few of you? Okay. How many of you taken like a theology 101 class or some kind of Bible class, maybe in college? None of this is new to you. It's been explained. It's in your head. And we create these mental categories of who Jesus is, and we get that and we understand that. If I had someone who here had no idea of this would be aha moments. You know, if they were coming from a different faith or an atheist background, this would be, you know, we'd have to take some time. We'd have to work through this. We'd have to help them understand that. And it's good for us to think through these things. It's good for us to think critically about what John is saying here. And we need to form good and proper theological definitions. And we need to wrestle with that. How could Jesus be with God? And how could Jesus be God? And how does that work? How do they operate together? But what in the world does that mean to your life? Far often, as I mentioned earlier, I think Jesus has become too small. And I'm all for singing the hymns like, what a friend we have in Jesus, because Jesus says that in his word. Those are the words of Jesus. I'm all for saying that, you know, that Jesus is, God is our Father, Christ is our brother. I had that hymn going through my head this weekend. It's joyful, joyful, we adore thee, Ed, just so you know. I'm teasing you. I had that in my head, but why? I mean, there's other faiths that kind of come close. You know, Jehovah Witnesses, Jesus is this powerful being, but Jesus is still a created man. So why is that important? And in the Mormon faith, there was the spiritual mother and father of Jesus, and he climbed the ranks in the heavens, and Jesus turned out to be the good son, and Satan, brothers of Jesus, by the way. This is all Latter-day Saints teaching, is, Satan's just a brother of Jesus, and it's almost this yin and yang, good power and bad power. And so can we go down that road? The problem with all of that is what we've done is we've made Jesus too small. And then when we hit some circumstance in our life, we hit some trouble, and we are just like the first century, if we want to call them Christians, at the manger scene, or just slightly before, we cry out, God, where are you? Because I don't see you, and you're not around. And there's this friend of mine who died too early. Where were you, Jesus? Or I got this diagnosis of cancer, or whatever that is. Where are you, Jesus? Or my marriage is just not where it should be. Where are you, Jesus? Or I'm struggling, I'm so tired of struggling with the same temptation. Jesus, where are you? And in doing that, we forget who he is. And if somehow we say, God, okay, I know I need more faith, because I pray that, do you pray that? Like, God, just grant me more faith. But the more faith comes from understanding the more Jesus and how great he is, and to actually to spend time, just even if you spend time meditating on just these first two verses. That he is the very where in the beginning was the Word. That's the very full revelation of who God is. That ought to blow our minds away, because compared to every other faith in the world, God does not reveal himself to his creation. Rather, his creation is left struggling to try to somehow figure out who he is and then please him. Sometimes our attitude of faith, even in the Christmas season, and I heard this from another pastor, and it resonated me. Our Christian faith is just another Santa Claus is coming to town theology. Think about it. Sing the song in your head. He's making a list. Who's been naughty? Who's been nice? And he's checking it. He's checking it twice. And he's watching. Oh, he's watching you. And we try to be nice. We try hard not to be naughty. Why? So we can have some gifts on Christmas morning. So we can have the blessings of God on my life. It's the Santa Claus is coming to town theology. And that's as great as our God is. Or maybe, and maybe it's not even that great. Maybe it's just elf on a shelf. And it's a little cookie or a little treat that you get if we appease him. John, before he tells the story of who Jesus is, before he explains all the gifts, all the blessings, all the miracles, he says, in the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was the Word. Next, why this is so important to your faith. Why did Jesus have to be God and equal to God? It's all because of his plan of salvation for his creation. This revelation of the Word was God becoming near, but it wasn't just God becoming near for a moment, but it's because God wanted us to be with him. So you hear the gospel message, right? So for God to be God, then God has to be completely holy, right? All loving, completely good, not 1 ounce of bad, completely just, not 1 ounce of unfairness. Some people say, well, God can do anything. No, God can't do anything. You're looking at me weird. God can't lie. God can't cheat. God literally can't do it. It's not in his nature. There's not a choice for him. He just can't do it. God can't grant injustice. He just can't do it. It's not who he is. It's impossible for him to lie or to steal. It's not in his nature, and that's a huge problem for you and I. Because for you and I to be near God in this lifetime or in heaven the next, something has to happen. Because even if there's one little dark spot on your little pinky toe that makes you imperfect, you can't be near God. I don't care how much, nail polish you try to cover it up. You can't be near God. You can't. Otherwise, God wouldn't be all perfect, good, and just. So in order for God to be just, he had to make payment for that sin, for that darkness. And okay, I know Jesus died for my sins. I get this, but we need to understand the Word, God himself, the very revelation of all that God is. God himself had to die for the sin of the world. It's not enough. And this is where the Jehovah's Witnesses and this is where the Mormon faith get it all wrong. They'll say, I believe the same thing. No, you don't, because if God was a created being, maybe, and probably not, maybe theologically one man could die for another man. I don't think so, but maybe. But certainly not the sin of the world. Certainly not the darkness that exists in your heart and my heart. And not just to forgive us our sin, but to rescue us, and the Bible says, and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. That's just not for heaven. That's for today. So the anger you struggle with, the lust you struggle with, the pride you struggle with, the selfishness you struggle with, Jesus is making payment, has made payment for that sin, and every day until the end, for all eternity. God himself had to die. But what's more than that, when Jesus says, I am with the Father, and the Father is within me. I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. I love the Father, and the Father loves me. Jesus invites you into that exact same eternal relationship that he existed for all time. This ought to blow our minds. The same love that the Father has for Jesus, the Bible is very clear the Father has for you. Our God is too small. We live in a world where I got to earn my love. My wife's mad at me again. What do I got to do? My kids aren't wanting to hang out with me. What do I got to do? Now these people at work, I can't seem to please my boss. We don't understand the love of God. I'm just telling you that. We do not get it. And Jesus says, this Word who existed from all eternity, from all time, the Father was, the Son, the Word was with the Father. And now Jesus says, you get to be with us, not as God, but you get to be invited into that relationship. These aren't just cheesy words to start out a gospel. This is everything. And the challenge that we face is that they're not everything to us. They're just theological things that we think about now and then. We miss the whole framework. We miss the bigger plan that becomes a personal plan. For me, I think about this, and I'll close with this. This being with Jesus, the bigness, for every person that cries out to God, every person on the planet, every person for all eternity, every person, whether in punishment or in heaven, every person at all times, what if we all cried out to God at the exact same time? And God could say, I'm with you, I can interact with you at the exact same time. That ought to blow our minds away. Even in this moment, God can interact and say, I am with you. I'm stepping into this pain because I'm God. I can step into to healing you or not healing you. It's my choice because I'm God. I could step into your marriage and heal it. And just a little trick around the marriage healing, God's going to bring healing to you first. Does that make sense? Are you getting where I'm going with that? But when we say, God, do that, we have to think back to John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning, He existed. So this holiday, He exists with you. If you said yes to Jesus, He wants to step in with you. I'm going to invite the worship team to come on up. I've asked them to sing the song as a reprise of Jesus being the lion and the lamb, because that's just so hard for us to get our minds around. But before they do that, would you just bow in prayer with me? Jesus, these words of John, from your word, we've heard them. We've repeated them. Maybe we've memorized them. For certain, even after today, we could recite them. But we just, with open hands and open hearts, we just have to admit to you, we don't get them. So I pray, would you increase our faith, Jesus? Very often our behaviors and our prayers and our attitudes and our beliefs, very often they prove we don't believe them. Our discouragement or our despair, our fears almost prove that we don't believe them. So Jesus, you know that, and by your grace you can change that. So for every person here, Jesus, over the next 4 weeks, this Advent season, I would pray that you would step into their situation. You would step into that sinful habit. You would step into that pain of the lost loved one. That you would step into what's going on in people's bodies and minds. But most of all, I pray that you would increase our faith, that we'd understand who you are. For your glory, Jesus, we pray. Amen.